Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's Lisa here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make two cards using colour block backgrounds, and I'm mostly going to be using products from Hero Arts on my cards today. So the die that I'm going to be using on both of my cards today is the Flowery Vines Fancy die. It's a really pretty die, and I've cut some panels of cardstock. I'm going to be using Paradise, Arctic, Meadow, Kiwi and Dove White. I've also cut a couple of white panels, and these measure 5 by 3 3/4 inches. So I'm going to start off with my striped background. I'm going to cut a 1-inch strip from each of those 5 colours of cardstock. So I've just popped the Paradise panel into my paper trimmer, lined it up with the measuring guide and cut off 1 inch from that panel. I'm doing the same now with the Arctic cardstock. So just finishing off cutting the strips from the Meadow and Kiwi cardstocks as well. I did need to trim a little bit off each of those before I measured out the 1-inch strip, just to make sure they're all completely even. And now finishing off with the Dove White. So this is how our completed strips are now looking, and we're going to adhere these onto our white panels. So if you remember, this white panel is 3 3/4 by 5 inches, and I'm just going to add some precision glue onto the top section of that panel. So I'm now going to place down my first stripe or strip, whatever you want to call it. That is the Paradise one, and I'm making sure here that it's really well lined up with the top. I want to make sure that I don't go kind of wonky from the start, I suppose. So I make sure that that's really lined up properly before I add my glue, and then go ahead and adhere that Kiwi stripe down, making sure that I butt it up really closely to the one above. And now I'm adding the white, followed by the Arctic, and then I'm going to finish with the Meadow at the bottom. I'm going to flip that panel over and just trim off the excess from the sides. So that's our first panel completed. I really love the wide stripes, but I thought I would show you a rectangular colour block background as well. So I'm just using 4 colours for this background. I'm dropping the white, and I'm going to cut some rectangles which are 2 by 2.5 inches. Now just cutting the rectangle from Arctic. I really love that colour, and finishing off with Paradise. So that's the 4 rectangles which we're now going to adhere onto our other white panel. So I'm just finding the centre point there. So your centre point is going to be at 2.5 and 1 7/8. So I'm just drawing some faint pencil lines just so that will help me place my rectangles. The rectangles are actually going to be a little bit larger than that panel, but I am going to be cutting off the excess. So now that I've got my 4 areas marked out, I'm going to add some precision glue to the top right and place the first rectangle. And again, with your first rectangle, you want to be really precise about how that is laid down. All of your other 3 rectangles are going to be based off that first one. You're going to be making sure that you butt them up really closely against that top rectangle. So it's really important that that's on straight, otherwise you'll end up with slightly and probably only very slightly off rectangles, but it does become noticeable even if you're just slightly wonky. Trust me, I know, I've done this many times. And just finishing off with the final rectangle, which is Paradise, and I'm going to trim the excess off the sides to give us our completed panel. So we're going to move on to our die cutting now. This is the Flowery Vines Fancy die. I've die cut it 5 times already, but I'm now going to die cut it a 6th time from white cardstock. So I've taped it down and I'm running that through my Platinum 6 die cutting machine. Apologies for it moving around. I've got new plates, so it takes a little bit of extra pressure to get those through. So now that it's through, I can remove that tape and just use a tool-in-one to poke out all of those pieces. It die cut really well, so they pop out very easily. And I'm now just going to turn over that die and start to ease the die cut out of that frame, just being careful as it is an intricate die, but it does come out really easily. So I'm now going to go ahead and adhere all of these together. I'm going to have a stack of 3 die cuts for each of my cards. And here I'm adding some precision glue onto a stack of 2 before I place that final die cut on top. Now you could do this with double-sided adhesive sheet. I prefer to use precision glue or wet adhesive, just because that gives you an opportunity. As you can see there, I did put it down and it wasn't really lined up very well, so I was able to pick that up really easily and replace that back down. And I'm now just going to fiddle around and just make sure that each of those leaves is lined up as best as possible. It does take a little while to do this, but the dimension is really nice at the end. Now that I've finished with the die cutting, I'm going to adhere my colour block backgrounds onto some white note cards. So these are standard American sized A2 note cards. I've added some precision glue onto the back and I'm just going to place that down on top of that base card. And I'm going to repeat the process for the striped background as well. So just making sure that's really well centered on that cardstock. I do pick it up, and that's the advantage of wet adhesive. It does allow you to move that around just to make sure it's perfect. And I'm now going to pop some glue onto the back of my stack of die cuts and place that down over the top. And the dimension of these stacks of die cuts is really beautiful. As the cardstock is quite thick and there are 3 layers, it really makes a difference on the final card. So just making sure they were glued down properly. And I'm now going to work on my embellishment. So this is the beautiful butterfly stamp set, and I'm going to take 3 of those butterflies and I'm going to heat emboss them onto vellum. I've popped some vellum into my MISTI. I'm just taking out the 3 butterflies that I think are going to work best on my design. I'm picking those up with my lid, and I'm now going to prep my vellum with an anti-static powder bag. I've brushed off any excess and I'm using some clear embossing and Watermark ink, just putting that onto the 3 butterfly stamps and placing that down onto the vellum. I did repeat the process before applying my white detail embossing powder, and I do add a couple of layers of that powder on top before I start the heat setting. So I just want to make sure that the powder is completely covering that sticky ink before I heat set it. I'm going to funnel that white detail powder back into its little jar, and now we're going to go ahead and heat emboss the vellum. So when you're heat embossing on vellum, you can very easily warp that vellum. The best way of avoiding that is to make sure that your heat gun isn't in any one area of that vellum for any length of time. So I generally use my heat tool at the front and the back of the vellum, and you can see there I'm moving it to the side every now and again, and I'm just not holding it over one area at all for very long. It does seem like it's never going to melt, but all of a sudden the heat embossing starts to work, and hopefully that means you'll avoid warping. So I'm just going to tape these down with their coordinating dies and run those through my die cutting machine. White heat embossing on vellum is always so pretty, and I think it's especially pretty when you do it with butterflies. So those are the 3 butterflies. We're now going to work on our sentiment. This is the Message Strips Stamp and Cut XL set. I'm taking 2 of those sentiments and I'm prepping some pitch black cardstock with an anti-static powder tool, brushing off the excess, and I'm now going to pop on some sticky ink and stamp that down onto that cardstock. Again, I'm going to be white heat embossing, so just pressing those down before I add my powder on top. And I always tend to add extra layers. I usually do 3 with sentiments just to make sure I've got good coverage. So those have been heat embossed off camera, and I'm just using a tool and one here just to remove any tiny little flecks of white that I still had on the cardstock after the heat embossing. And I'm now going to go ahead and cut both of those out with the coordinating die from that stamp set. So just placing that die down with some yellow tape, and I'm going to run those through my die cutting machine. And we can now go ahead and add these onto our cards. So I did think about popping these up with some foam tape, but as I already had some dimension from the die cutting, I thought I would just add these flat on top. So just using some precision glue and placing those down. And I'm now going to add those vellum butterflies. So I'm adding tiny dabs of glue onto the back of the butterflies, and I'm just adding the glue where the white lines from the heat embossing are visible through the back. That way you hide your glue so you won't see any of that on the final card. And I'm just going to repeat the process for the other 2 butterflies. And now that the 2 cards are side by side, you will be able to see that I adhered the Flowery Vines die cut in 2 different orientations. On one card I adhered it with the vines travelling to the top, and on the other they were travelling from the top down to the bottom of the card. So you can use that set 2 different ways. Just adding some sequins on now for a little bit of sparkle, and that brings us to the end of the cards. All the supplies that I've used are listed in the description box below. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that these give you some ideas for making your own colour block backgrounds for your cards. And if you want to see more from me, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button coming up. Bye for now.